On the morning of March 14th, 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence officers at Jever Airfield in northwestern Germany gathered around photographs pinned to a briefing board. The images, taken by reconnaissance flights over England, showed something that shouldn't have been there. Rows of RAF bombers with bright red garden gnomes painted on their noses, fuselages and tail fins. Some wore pointed hats, others carried fishing rods or wheelbarrows. One particularly detailed gnome on a Lancaster bomber of 617 Squadron appeared to be mooning the camera. These weren't the intimidating nose art the Germans expected. No snarling tigers, no busty pin-ups, no grim reapers. These were cheerful, absurd, deliberately ridiculous lawn ornaments that belonged in suburban gardens, not on four-engine heavy bombers carrying 14,000 pounds of high explosives into the Reich. German pilots reported seeing them at attack altitude. The gnomes grinned from the sides of Lancasters as flak burst around them. They smiled from Halifaxes limping home on 3 engines. They waved from Stirlings dropping mines in the Baltic. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Knoke wrote in his diary that encountering a gnome-painted bomber at night felt like being mocked by a laughing ghost. This shouldn't have mattered. Combat effectiveness had nothing to do with paint schemes. Yet by mid-1943, German intelligence was dedicating man-hours to tracking gnome sightings, and Luftwaffe pilots were specifically targeting gnome-painted aircraft in combat formations. What started as a private joke among RAF crews had evolved into something the Air Ministry never intended. Psychological warfare that worked precisely because it was so profoundly, infuriatingly stupid. The Germans weren't wrong to be disturbed. They were wrong about why it worked. Standard military thinking emphasized nose art as morale building for crews and intimidation for enemies. American bomber groups painted fierce names like Memphis Belle and Hell's Angels on their B-17. Soviet pilots adorned their fighters with red stars and fierce slogans. The Luftwaffe itself had perfected menacing shark mouths on Mi-10-9s during the Battle of Britain. Military psychologists in every air force agreed. Combat imagery should project strength, aggression, and lethality. Your aircraft should look like what it was, a weapon of war. The RAF's bomber command certainly started that way. Early war nose art featured bulldogs and lions, bombs with wings, and aggressive squadron crests. Flight Lieutenant James Ginger Lacey's Hurricane in 1940 carried 23 kill markings and a snarling bear. This was proper warrior imagery. Then, in January 1943, something shifted in 103 Squadron based at Elsham Wolds in Lincolnshire. Flight Sergeant Peter Nobby Clarke purchased a ceramic garden gnome from a shop in Scunthorpe during a 48-hour leave. The exact date was January 18th, 1943. He paid 2 shillings 6pence. The gnome was 11 inches tall, painted in garish reds and blues, and wore an expression of vacant cheerfulness that Clarke's crew found hilarious after 3 months of night bombing missions over the Ruhr. They named it Reginald. As a joke, and this is critical, it started as purely a joke, Clarke's ground crew painted Reginald's likeness on the nose of their Lancaster ED-863, using the same bright colours as the ceramic original. On their next mission, January 23, 1943, targeting the Dusseldorf rail yards, Clarke's crew claimed 3 kills of their own, making it back alive, not getting lost, and making the Germans wonder what the hell they'd just seen. When they landed at 03:47 hours, other crews crowded around to see the gnome. Within a week, 7 more Lancasters at Elsham Wolds bore gnome nose art. Within a month, the practice had spread to 4 other squadrons. By March, RAF intelligence was receiving captured German documents specifically mentioning gnome bombers in engagement reports. The Luftwaffe's reaction revealed something about military psychology that the RAF hadn't anticipated. German intelligence operated on systematic principles refined since the Great War. They catalogued enemy markings, tracked squadron insignia, identified individual aircraft, and built detailed order of battle assessments. This wasn't paranoia, it was professional competence. Knowing that B. Baker of 106 Squadron was flown by an experienced crew with 23 successful missions helped Luftwaffe night fighters prioritise targets. But gnomes broke the system. Major Hajo Hermann, architect of Germany's wild boar night fighter tactics, wrote in a post-war memoir that gnome markings created analytical chaos. Were they squadron identifiers, crew traditions, some new British psychological operation? Intelligence officers at Luftwaffe operations staff spent hours in April 1943 trying to decode the gnome pattern. They noted that gnomes appeared across multiple squadrons in different colours, with varying accessories. Some gnomes carried tools, others carried weapons, a few appeared to be drunk. One Halifax bomber from 76 Squadron featured a gnome riding a bomb like a rodeo cowboy. The Germans did what German military intelligence always did. They systematised it. They created Gartenzwerg-Index, the Gnome Index reports. They photographed gnome-painted aircraft. They interrogated captured RAF crews about the significance of specific gnome designs. Flight Lieutenant Robert Palmer, shot down over Hamburg in May 1943, was questioned for 45 minutes about why his Lancaster's gnome wore a blue hat instead of red. Palmer, who genuinely didn't know and didn't care, told them it was because Nigel preferred blue. This answer was recorded, translated and filed. This wasn't accidental disruption. By summer 1943, the RAF understood exactly what was happening. Wing Commander Guy Gibson, leading 617 Squadron, the Dambusters, actively encouraged gnome art after noting in his log that "Jerry seems unsettled by our garden friends." The campaign wasn't ordered from above. It emerged organically from squadron culture, but it was amplified deliberately once its effect became clear. What made this work wasn't any single feature, but rather the collision between German operational culture and British humour. The Luftwaffe was not humourless. German pilots had their own jokes and traditions, but German military culture in 1943 was grinding under existential pressure. The Eastern Front was consuming divisions, Allied bombing was intensifying, resource shortages were worsening, every aspect of the war effort required efficiency, seriousness, and systematic response. Then came the gnomes. Professor R. V. Jones, head of British scientific intelligence, noted in a 1943 memo that the enemy expends more effort trying to understand what doesn't matter than countering what does. This wasn't unique to Germans. All intelligence services struggled to distinguish signal from noise, but the systematic German approach, so effective at cataloguing genuine threats, became a trap when confronted with deliberate absurdity. Consider the case of Oberleutnant Wilhelm Jonen, a successful night fighter pilot with 34 kills. In his book, Duel Under the Stars, Jonen describes encountering a gnome-painted Halifax on the night of June 16, 1943, over Cologne. He manoeuvred into position, ready to fire, when his radar operator called out the gnome marking. Jonen hesitated, not from fear but from a moment of cognitive dissonance. Why would they mark it that way, he thought. Is it a decoy? A special operations aircraft? That 3-second pause allowed the Halifax's tail gunner to spot him. Jonen broke off, survived, and never mentioned it in his combat report. But he remembered it enough to write about it years later. That was the weapon. Not fear, not intimidation, cognitive friction. Battlefields aren't pristine testing grounds. They're exhausting, terrifying environments where split-second decisions determine survival. Adding an element of the surreal, the unexpected, the "this doesn't belong here," created a micro-delay in enemy processing. 3 seconds of "why is there a garden gnome?" could mean the difference between a clean attack run and defensive fire finding its mark. By August 1943, gnome art had evolved from simple profiles to elaborate scenes. Sergeant Ronald Lance Lancaster, a nose artist in 467 Squadron, painted a series showing gnomes engaged in various acts of defiance. Fishing in bomb craters, gardening in the Ruhr's ruins, mooning the Reichstag. Each gnome took approximately 4 hours to paint using available aircraft enamels. The colours, bright reds, blues, yellows, were deliberately garish, chosen specifically because they contrasted with standard RAF dark green and black night camouflage. Some squadrons developed signature styles. 103 Squadron gnomes wore red hats exclusively. 76 Squadron gnomes always carried fishing rods. 460 Squadron, an Australian unit, painted gnomes with boomerangs. The variation was important. It prevented the Germans from using gnome markings as reliable identification tools. A single captured crew couldn't explain the entire system because there was no system. It was organised chaos, which was precisely the point. The Air Ministry's response was revealing. Official policy, documented in Air Ministry Order 1098 dated September 1943, stated that nose art was permitted within bounds of decorum and operational security. The order specifically mentioned gnomes, noting they present no security risk and appear to maintain crew morale. This was bureaucratic language, for we don't understand why this works, but don't stop it. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, head of Bomber Command, was more direct. In a meeting recorded by his aide on October 12, 1943, Harris said, "If painting Mickey Mouse on a Lancaster helps my crews come home, I don't care. If it bothers Jerry, even better. If it does both, it's the cheapest weapon we've got." The cost-benefit analysis was stark. A garden gnome painting required 4 hours of a ground crew member's time, and perhaps 5 shillings worth of paint. In exchange, German intelligence officers spent cumulative hundreds of hours trying to decode gnome patterns. Luftwaffe pilots hesitated, even briefly, when engaging gnome-marked aircraft, and RAF crews flew with slightly higher morale, carrying a physical reminder that their service, while deadly serious, didn't require surrendering every aspect of humour and humanity. Post-war intelligence analysis confirmed what the RAF had suspected. Captured Luftwaffe documents from 1943 to 44 showed gnome-painted aircraft appearing in German reports with unusual frequency. A typical intelligence summary from September 1943, recovered from Luftflotte 3 headquarters, listed 16 RAF aircraft engaged over France. 3 were described with standard identifiers. 13 were listed as gnome-marked, with varying levels of detail. This created practical problems for German tactical coordination. When a night fighter pilot radioed that he was engaging a Lancaster with a gnome, controllers couldn't effectively vector other fighters to assist because dozens of Lancasters carried gnomes. The marking system that should have helped identification instead created confusion. More telling were the interrogation reports. RAF crew members shot down and captured were routinely questioned about squadron markings and tactics. Standard British training taught crews to reveal only name, rank, and serial number. But German interrogators often opened sessions by asking about gnomes, apparently hoping for easy intelligence wins through casual conversation. Flying Officer Dennis Hart, shot down in November 1943, reported after the war that his interrogator seemed genuinely bothered by the gnomes. He asked if they were magic symbols, if they had occult significance, if we were trying to curse German pilots. Hart had no answers because his crew had simply copied the design from another aircraft they thought looked funny. The Germans weren't stupid to ask these questions. Military organisations use symbols deliberately. Unit crests convey history and tradition. Nose art often reflects crew superstitions. The problem was that gnomes were simultaneously meaningful, they boosted morale, and meaningless, they had no tactical significance. That paradox was unsolvable through conventional intelligence analysis. Gnome art peaked in late 1943 and declined through 1944, not because it stopped being effective, but because the nature of the air war changed. The introduction of long-range American fighter escorts meant German interceptors faced different tactical challenges. The shift to daylight precision bombing reduced the importance of night camouflage schemes. New aircraft arrivals came with standardized paint jobs that crews were less inclined to modify, and frankly, the joke got old. By D-Day in June 1944, perhaps 15% of Bomber Command aircraft still carried gnome markings, down from roughly 35% in autumn 1943. The last confirmed gnome-painted aircraft, a Lancaster from 103 Squadron, the squadron that started it, flew its final mission on March 22, 1945, targeting rail yards at Bremen. The gnome, named Reginald III in honour of the original, survived the war and now sits in the RAF Museum at Hendon, its ceramic ancestor having been lost during a squadron move in 1944. The military value of Operation Garden Ornament, no one officially called it that, but the name stuck in squadron lore, was difficult to quantify. The RAF couldn't prove gnomes save specific aircraft or confuse specific German pilots in measurable ways, but they didn't need to. The operational cost was negligible, and even marginal psychological effects on enemy pilots were worth maintaining. Post-war interviews with Luftwaffe veterans confirmed lasting impressions. Johannes Steinhoff, a decorated fighter ace, mentioned gnomes in a 1974 interview. "We learned to take the RAF seriously in 1940, but the gnomes? They made us question if we understood our enemy at all. How could the same nation that produced the Spitfire and Wellington also produce garden gnomes on bombers? We never solved that puzzle. That was perhaps the deepest victory." The Germans spent intellectual effort trying to understand something that had no answer. Why gnomes? Because they were funny. because they were absurd, because putting something cheerful and domestic on an instrument of industrial destruction was so incongruous it became a form of defiance. Because RAF crews lived in Nissen huts on muddy airfields, flew through flak and fighter attacks, watched friends burn and die, and needed something, anything, to maintain the thin barrier between themselves and despair. This wasn't accidental psychological warfare. Commanders weren't clinging to tradition or following doctrine. They recognized that warfare operates on multiple dimensions: tactical, strategic, and psychological. The Gnomes had no tactical value. They didn't make aircraft faster or tougher or more lethal. Their strategic impact was marginal. They didn't change bombing accuracy or survival rates in measurable ways. But their psychological impact was real on both sides. For RAF crews, Gnomes represented continuity with civilian life, a visual reminder that England, with its gardens and villages and absurd ceramic lawn ornaments, was worth defending. For Germans, Gnomes represented the inexplicable, a reminder that their enemy operated from cultural assumptions they couldn't decode through Prussian military analysis. The deeper principle that made Gnome warfare work was this: systematic thinking is powerful but brittle. The German military machine in 1943 was extraordinarily competent at conventional problems. It could calculate fuel consumption, predict bomber streams, and coordinate complex night fighter operations. What it couldn't handle was the irrational, the pointless, the deliberately silly. Every hour German intelligence spent analysing Gnome patterns was an hour not spent on genuine threats. Every cognitive pause from a German pilot encountering a Gnome was a micro-advantage for the target aircraft. Modern military forces understand this now. Psychological operations are a recognised domain of warfare. But in 1943, the RAF stumbled into effective psyops through pure accident. Flight Sergeant Clarke bought a Gnome because it made him laugh. Other crews copied it because they needed laughter. The Air Ministry tolerated it because rigid enforcement of decorum seemed less important than crew morale. And the cumulative effect was something no one planned but everyone recognised once it emerged. A weapon that cost nothing and confused everything. The Germans expected professional warriors projecting martial valour. Instead, they encountered cheerful Gnomes carrying fishing rods, painted on bombers that still carried their deadly payloads with professional efficiency. That contrast, lethal capability wrapped in absurdist humour, was more unsettling than any aggressive nose art could have been. Battlefields aren't just about firepower and tactics. They're about will, morale, and the ability to maintain psychological coherence under extreme stress. The RAF crews who painted Gnomes understood something profound about their own humanity. They could do terrible, necessary things while still remembering they were fundamentally decent people who found garden gnomes funny. That self-awareness, that refusal to become what they were fighting, was worth more than any tactical advantage. And if it also drove the Germans a little bit crazy, well, that was just a bonus.